The rifle sight felt cold against my cheek, and I could hear Lieutenant Morrison's voice cutting through the radio static. "Reaper, you're off the shot. We're bringing in someone who can actually hit a target. 20 years of service, 3 tours in Afghanistan, and they were pulling me because my call sign sounded like a joke to them. The spotter beside me, a kid fresh from Quantico, wouldn't even meet my eyes. In that moment, with insurgents moving through the valley below and my finger resting beside the trigger guard, I knew this wasn't about my ability. It never had been. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. I'm sitting in my workshop now, 62 years old, with hands that still know how to clean a rifle blind but shake when I try to hold a coffee cup steady. The smell of gun oil and sawdust fills this place, mixing with the Virginia pine coming through the open door. My grandson thinks I'm out here building birdhouses, and maybe I am. But mostly I'm just trying to keep my hands busy so my mind doesn't wander back to places it shouldn't go. There's a shadow box on the wall, Purple Heart, Bronze Star, and a medal most people wouldn't recognize. 53 confirmed kills in theater. But nobody mentions those numbers at backyard barbecues. They ask if I was in the service, and when I say Marine Corps, they nod and change the subject. That's fine. Most of them couldn't handle the weight of what those years carried anyway. The local hardware store owner thanked me for my service last week, and I saw his eyes flicker down to my dark skin and back up, like he was doing math in his head, trying to figure out which war someone like me would have fought in. Vietnam, probably, he was thinking. They always think Vietnam. Sometimes I let them think it. It's easier than explaining that I was in Helmand Province while their kids were in college, that I spent my 40th birthday in a sniper hide watching Taliban fighters through a scope, breathing shallow so the condensation from my breath wouldn't give away our position. The young ones don't know what to do with an old black man who was a Marine sniper. It doesn't fit their movies. Their heroes don't look like me, don't talk like me, don't come from neighborhoods where the sound of gunfire means something different than it does downrange. The smell of diesel fuel does it every time. Catches me off guard, pulls me back 30 years like I'm on a rope. Yesterday I was at the gas station filling up my truck when a semi rolled past, and suddenly I wasn't in Fredericksburg anymore. I was back at Camp Leatherneck, standing on the flight line with my rifle case, watching the heat shimmer off the runway in waves. The air tasted like dust and jet fuel, and my sergeant, Rodriguez, built like a fire hydrant with a mustache that violated regulation, was checking manifests with a clipboard that looked tiny in his hands. "Another rotation, Bishop," he said, not looking up. "Try not to think too much out there. Thinking gets you killed." He meant it as advice, the kind of wisdom you pass down in the Corps. But what he didn't know was that thinking was the only thing that kept me alive. Calculating wind speed, barometric pressure, target distance, the Coriolis effect on a bullet traveling 2,000 meters. My brain was always 3 steps ahead, running numbers like a computer, because that's what they trained me to do. That's what he trained me to do, but nobody knew about that training yet. Not Rodriguez, not the platoon, not even the battalion commander. They just knew I was Bishop, the quiet sniper from Detroit who kept to himself and cleaned his rifle more than he talked. They knew my call sign, Reaper, and some of them snickered because they thought it was ironic. A black Marine from the inner city with a call sign about death. They couldn't see past their assumptions long enough to ask why I had that name, or who gave it to me, or what I'd done to earn it. Staff Sergeant Kowalski started it, though he wasn't the first to think it. We were in the team room at the forward operating base, a plywood structure that smelled like sweat and Copenhagen tobacco. Maps covered every wall, marked with grease pencil, showing patrol routes and known enemy positions. Kowalski was leaning against the table, arms crossed, looking at me like I was a problem he couldn't solve. "Bishop," he said, and I heard the edge in his voice. "That's a chess piece, right? The one that moves diagonal?" I nodded. Didn't say anything because I knew where this was going. "Funny," he continued, "because snipers need to shoot straight. Not diagonal, not curved. Straight." The other guys in the room got quiet. Martinez pretended to be interested in his weapon cleaning. Thompson suddenly found his boots fascinating. Nobody wanted to be part of this conversation. But nobody was going to stop it either. Maybe you got the wrong specialty, Bishop. Maybe you should have been supply. Lots of diagonal thinking in logistics. He smiled when he said it. The kind of smile that wasn't friendly, wasn't joking, wasn't anything but a challenge wrapped in an insult. I'd heard worse. Grew up hearing worse on the streets of Detroit. Heard it in recruit training when a drill instructor asked if I could even read the manual. Heard it at sniper school when they questioned whether someone from my neighborhood could handle the patience required. Patience. Like growing up poor and black in America didn't teach you patience every single day. Like waiting for a bus that might not come. Like watching opportunities pass you by because of your zip code. Like biting your tongue when someone assumes you're dangerous just because of how you look. Like none of that required more patience than lying in the dirt for 16 hours waiting for a target. I looked at Kowalski and said nothing. That bothered him more than any response I could have given. The mission brief the next morning made it clear things were escalating. Captain Henderson stood at the front of the briefing room, pointer tapping against a satellite image of a valley in Helmand Province. Intelligence confirms a high-value target is moving through this area in 48 hours. We need to interdict. This is a precision strike. One shot, clean kill, immediate exfil. No room for error. His eyes swept the room and landed on me. Bishop, your primary sniper. Kowalski, your spotter. I saw Kowalski's jaw tighten, but he didn't object. Nobody objected to Captain Henderson. The captain was old-school Marine, gray at the temples, with 3 combat deployments and a reputation for not tolerating nonsense from anyone. He didn't care about the undercurrents in the team room, didn't care about the tension between me and Kowalski. He cared about mission success, and on paper I was the best shooter in the platoon. On paper. That night, Kowalski cornered me by the ammunition depot. The sun had set, and the base lights created harsh shadows across his face. "I'm not going out there with you," he said quietly. "I'm not putting my life in the hands of someone who got their rating because of diversity quotas." There it was, out loud, not hidden behind jokes or chess metaphors. Just raw, ugly prejudice in the desert air. I could have reported him. Should have reported him. But that would have made things worse. Would have made me the guy who couldn't handle the pressure, who ran to officers when things got tough. So instead, I said, "Then talk to the captain. Get yourself reassigned." Kowalski shook his head. "Can't. He already approved the roster. But when we're out there, when it matters, I'm calling the shot. Not you. You're just pulling the trigger. A trained monkey could do that." He walked away before I could respond, and I stood there in the darkness, listening to generators hum and distant voices from the chow hall, wondering how many times I'd have to prove myself before my skin color stopped being the first thing people saw. The night before we deployed, the FOB was quiet in the way that only military bases get quiet. Not peaceful. You could still hear generators, still hear the occasional radio chatter, still sense the tension of men preparing for violence. But quiet in the human sense. Most guys were in their racks, writing letters home or staring at photographs of people who felt impossibly far away. I was on the roof of our barracks, a flat plywood structure where you could see the stars better than anywhere else in Afghanistan. No light pollution out here, just the Milky Way stretched across the sky like a river of light. Made you feel small. Made you feel like maybe the things that happened down here, the prejudice, the assumptions, the daily grind of proving yourself, maybe they didn't matter in the grand scheme. But they did matter. They mattered because they could get you killed. I thought about my mother back in Detroit, working double shifts at the hospital so I could have school supplies and basketball shoes. Thought about my father who'd done 2 tours in Vietnam and came home to a country that didn't want him, who worked at the Ford plant for 30 years and never complained, never raised his voice, just showed up every day with his lunch pail and his dignity. He'd taught me that dignity was something nobody could take from you unless you gave it to them. "Don't let them make you small," he'd said before I shipped out to boot camp. "You're a Marine now. Act like it." So I did. I acted like it every day, even when Kowalski questioned my competence, even when other Marines looked at me and saw a quota instead of a qualified operator, even when I had to work twice as hard for half the recognition. Because that's what we did. That's what we'd always done. The helicopter insertion went smooth, which should have been my first warning. In combat, smooth starts usually mean rough endings. We flew nap of the earth, the Black Hawk hugging the terrain, pilot threading through valleys like he was born to it. The crew chief's face was impassive behind his helmet visor, but I could see his hands gripping his M240 a little too tight. He'd done this run before, knew what waited in these mountains. We were a six-man team. Me, Kowalski, Captain Henderson, two riflemen named Chen and Williams, and a combat controller named Burke, who could call in air support if things went sideways. We hit the landing zone 30 minutes before dawn, fast-roped into a dried riverbed, and the helicopter was gone before our boots settled in the dust. Immediate silence. That's the thing civilians don't understand about combat insertions. It's the silence that gets you. Your ears are ringing from the rotors, your heart's pounding from adrenaline, but the world around you is holding its breath, waiting to see what you'll do. We moved to our hide site, a rocky outcropping overlooking the valley where intelligence said our target would pass. It took us 6 hours to cover 3 kilometers, moving slow, checking every angle, making sure we weren't walking into an ambush. By the time we settled into position, the sun was high and the temperature was pushing 110 degrees. Kowalski sat up beside me, pulling out his spotting scope and rangefinder. He didn't look at me, didn't say a word, just started calculating range, wind speed, target vectors. Professional, cold, efficient. But I could feel the contempt radiating off him like heat off the sand. This was going to be a long stakeout. Then the radio crackled. Captain Henderson's voice came through, controlled but urgent. "Contact north. We've got movement, multiple hostiles. They're flanking our position." Everything changed in an instant. This wasn't a precision strike anymore. This was a firefight. Chen and Williams opened up with their M4s, controlled bursts echoing off the valley walls. Burke was on the radio calling for air support, giving coordinates in a rapid monotone. And Kowalski was panicking. I could see it in his eyes, the way his hands fumbled with the rangefinder, the way his breathing got rapid and shallow. "What's the range?" I asked calmly. There's too many. Range, Kowalski." "What's the range to the lead target?" He looked through the scope, and his voice cracked. 700 meters, maybe 750. Wind from the east, maybe 5 knots. I can't. I'd already made the calculations in my head. 730 meters, wind at 4.5 knots from the southeast. Temperature, elevation, barometric pressure. My rifle was already aimed, my breathing already controlled, my finger already applying pressure to the trigger. First shot, center mass, target down. Second shot, 3 seconds later. Another target down. Third shot, fourth. The rifle kicked against my shoulder with each round, familiar and controlled like a heartbeat. I wasn't thinking anymore. I was just doing what I'd been trained to do, what I'd spent 10,000 hours practicing, what someone had drilled into me until it was muscle memory. Kowalski was staring at me, his mouth open, watching me work. But there wasn't time for his shock. We had to survive first. Questions could come later. I dropped 6 hostiles in under 2 minutes. 6 targets at ranges between 600 and 800 meters, under fire, with a spotter who'd frozen up beside me. The math was simple once you knew the variables. Distance, wind, temperature, target movement, Coriolis effect. My rifle was zeroed at 600 meters, which meant I had to account for bullet drop at longer ranges. At 700 meters, the round would drop approximately 70 inches from point of aim. At 800, closer to 100 inches. But those numbers were just starting points. You had to factor in wind. Every knot of wind could push the bullet 4 to 6 inches off target at these ranges. Temperature affected air density, which affected drag on the bullet. The thinner air at altitude meant less resistance, which meant flatter trajectory, but also meant you had to recalculate everything you thought you knew. And then there was the human element. Target movement. Most people don't stand still when they're being shot at. You had to lead them, anticipate where they'd be when the bullet arrived, not where they were when you pulled the trigger. At 800 meters, time of flight was about 1 second. 1 second for the target to move, to dive, to do anything that would make you miss. But I didn't miss. I never missed. Because someone had taught me that missing wasn't an option. That in this job, in this profession, you got one shot and it had to count. Every time. No exceptions. No excuses. Kowalski finally found his voice. How did you? I cycled the bolt, chambered another round, kept scanning for threats. Training, I said. That's all I gave him. That's all he deserved. The memory came unbidden, triggered by the smell of gunpowder and stress. I was 14 years old, standing in my grandmother's kitchen in Detroit, and she was cooking collard greens on a stove that only had 2 working burners. The summer heat made the apartment feel like an oven, and the box fan in the window barely moved the air. My father was at work. My mother was at work. It was just me and Grandma, and she was telling me about her brother, my great-uncle Samuel, who'd fought in Korea. They put him in the segregated unit, she said, stirring the pot with a wooden spoon that had been in the family longer than I'd been alive. Treated him like he wasn't good enough to fight alongside white boys. But when the Chinese came pouring over that hill, when those white boys were running scared, Samuel stood his ground. Held that position for 6 hours. 6 hours, baby. And you know what his commanding officer said after? I shook my head. I was 14 and stupid and thought I knew everything. Said he was surprised. Surprised that a colored soldier could be so brave. She turned to look at me, and her eyes were hard. Don't ever let surprise be the best you can expect from people. Don't ever let them set the bar so low that just being competent makes you exceptional. You hear me? I heard her. But I didn't understand. Not then. Not until years later, when I was the one exceeding low expectations, when I was the one making officers surprised that I could perform under pressure. My great-uncle Samuel died in 1987. Liver failure from drinking too much, trying to forget things he couldn't forget. Nobody thanked him for his service. Nobody wrote stories about his bravery. He was just another black veteran who came home broken and stayed that way. The second wave hit us harder. RPGs screaming through the air, machine gun fire stitching the rocks around our position, dust and stone chips flying everywhere. Williams took shrapnel in his leg and went down hard. Chen was dragging him back to cover, and Burke was screaming into the radio that we needed immediate evac, that this was now a hot extract, that we had wounded. Captain Henderson was returning fire with his M4, controlled bursts, but I could see the calculation in his eyes. We were outnumbered, outgunned, and pinned down. The extraction helicopter was 20 minutes out. We didn't have 20 minutes. "Bishop!" Henderson shouted over the gunfire. "Can you hit the machine gun nest? North Ridge, 11 o'clock?" I swung my rifle around, found the target through my scope. It was an impossible shot. 900 meters, elevated position, wind gusting unpredictably through the valley, and the machine gunner was behind sandbags with only his head and shoulders exposed. Maybe a 10-inch target area. Maybe. At 900 meters with gusty wind, that was a shot you took in training and missed half the time. That was a shot you took in movies and somehow made because the script said so. That was not a shot you took in real combat with lives depending on it. Kowalski was staring at me. "You can't make that shot," he said. Not mean. Not insulting. Just stating a fact, the way you'd state that water is wet or the sky is blue. "You can't make that shot, Bishop. Nobody can." I could hear Williams moaning in pain. I could hear Burke's desperate radio calls. I could hear the machine gun tearing through our position, the sound of rounds hitting rock, the sound of men dying, and I thought about my great-uncle Samuel, standing on a hill in Korea, holding ground because that's what you did. That's what we'd always done. I steadied my breathing, calculated the wind, adjusted for elevation and distance, and pulled the trigger. The machine gun went silent. Through my scope, I watched the gunner slump forward, and I knew. Center mass, maybe 2 inches left of where I'd aimed because the wind gust came stronger than I'd calculated, but center mass nonetheless. The hostile position erupted into chaos, fighters scrambling, trying to figure out where the shot came from. I didn't give them time to figure it out. 2 more shots, 2 more targets down. The enemy fire slackened, and Henderson used the opportunity to pull us back to a more defensible position. Kowalski was still staring at me, and now there was something different in his eyes. Not respect, not yet, but recognition. The kind of recognition you give when you realize you've been fundamentally wrong about something. "Where did you train?" he asked, and his voice was quiet now, personal. "Who taught you to shoot like that?" I didn't answer. Not because I was being difficult, but because the truth was complicated, and we were still under fire, and explaining my past wasn't going to help us survive the present. But I could see him working through it in his head, trying to reconcile the Marine he'd dismissed with the Marine who'd just saved all our lives. The helicopter came in hot, taking fire on approach, and we loaded Williams first, then Chen, then Burke. Kowalski climbed in, and Henderson grabbed my shoulder. "You good?" he asked. I nodded. I was always good. That's what they trained me to do. We lifted off under fire, rounds pinging off the helicopter's armor, and I watched Afghanistan shrink below us. Another mission. Another day survived. Another moment where I'd had to prove I belonged. I was tired. God, I was tired. But I couldn't show it. Never show it. That's rule one for someone like me in a world like this. The moment came 3 days later, back at Camp Leatherneck. We were in the debriefing room, a sterile space with fluorescent lights and a projector showing satellite imagery of our engagement. Captain Henderson was giving his report to the battalion commander, a full bird colonel named Patterson, who'd been in the Corps longer than I'd been alive. Kowalski was there, Chen and Burke. Even Williams wheeled in with his leg in a cast. Standard after-action review. Nothing unusual, except Patterson kept looking at me. Not suspicious, not angry, just curious, like he was trying to remember something, trying to place a face he'd seen before. When Henderson finished his report, Patterson leaned back in his chair and said, "Bishop, that's an interesting name. Detroit, right?" I nodded. "You attended Scout Sniper School in 2003? Another nod. Patterson smiled, and it wasn't a friendly smile, wasn't a mean smile, just a smile of recognition. "You had an interesting instructor, as I recall. Someone who doesn't usually teach basic courses." The room got very quiet. Kowalski was leaning forward now, paying attention. Henderson's eyes narrowed slightly. Patterson continued. "Says here in your file that you were top of your class. Perfect scores in every category. Range estimation, ballistics calculation, stalking, camouflage, fieldcraft. But what really stands out is the recommendation letter. Most recommendation letters are pretty standard. Good Marine, solid performer, recommend for advancement. But yours is different." He pulled out a piece of paper, yellowed with age, and started reading. "This Marine represents the pinnacle of snipercraft. His technical proficiency is matched only by his tactical judgment and moral character. I would trust him in any situation, at any range, under any conditions. He has the potential to be one of the finest snipers the Corps has ever produced." Patterson looked up. "That letter is signed by someone I think you all know." Patterson let the silence hang for a moment, watching the room, watching me. Then he said the name. Admiral Charles Whitmore. The room erupted. Not loud, not dramatic, but you could feel the shift in energy, the sudden intake of breath, the way everyone sat up straighter. Admiral Whitmore wasn't just any flag officer. He was a legend. Before he was an admiral, before he commanded carrier groups, before he advised presidents on military strategy, he was the Marine Corps' most decorated sniper. Vietnam, Beirut, Panama, Desert Storm. 400 confirmed kills over a 20-year career. They made documentaries about him. They wrote books about him. Kids studying military history knew his name the way they knew Patton or MacArthur. And somehow, he'd been my instructor. Kowalski's face had gone pale. "That's not possible," he said, and his voice was barely a whisper. "Whitmore doesn't teach basic courses. He hasn't taught in decades." Patterson shook his head. "Normally you'd be right, but in 2003, Whitmore was recovering from surgery, took shrapnel in Somalia years earlier, and it finally caught up with him. Doctors said he needed to take it easy for 6 months, so he volunteered to teach one class at Scout Sniper School. Just one class, 24 students. Bishop here was one of them." Henderson was looking at me now, and I could see him recalculating everything, seeing me in a different light. Patterson continued, "Whitmore doesn't give recommendations lightly. In fact, this is the only recommendation letter in his file. Just this one. For Bishop." And he wrote something else at the bottom. Something that's not official. Just a handwritten note. Patterson held up the paper, and I could see Whitmore's cramped handwriting at the bottom. It says, "This Marine will save lives. Remember his name! Reaper." That's when Kowalski understood. That's when they all understood. My call sign wasn't a joke. It wasn't ironic. It was given to me by the greatest sniper in Marine Corps history, because I'd earned it. The silence in the room was absolute. I watched Kowalski's face cycle through emotions. Shock, disbelief, shame. Henderson was nodding slowly, like pieces of a puzzle were finally clicking together. Williams, despite his pain, was grinning. Burke just kept shaking his head, muttering, "Damn." Patterson closed the file and looked directly at me. "Why didn't you ever mention this, Bishop? Why let people think—" He didn't finish the sentence, but we all knew what he meant. "Why let people underestimate you? Why not use your connection to a legend to gain instant credibility?" I thought about my answer carefully. Thought about my father at the Ford plant, showing up every day with quiet dignity. Thought about my great-uncle Samuel, holding that hill in Korea without expecting thanks. Thought about my grandmother in that hot Detroit kitchen, teaching me that surprise shouldn't be the best I could expect. "Sir," I said, "if I have to tell people I'm good, then I'm not good enough. The work speaks for itself. Eventually." Patterson studied me for a long moment, then nodded. "You're right. The work does speak. And your work out there saved 5 Marines. That speaks pretty damn loud." He stood up, and everyone snapped to attention. "Dismissed. Except you, Bishop. Stay for a minute." The others filed out, Kowalski last, and he paused at the door looking back at me. I couldn't read his expression. Maybe he couldn't either. When the room was empty, Patterson sat back down and gestured for me to sit. "I served with Whitmore in the Gulf," he said quietly. "Saw him make shots that defied physics. But you know what impressed me most about him? It wasn't his shooting. It was his judgment. Who to shoot, when not to shoot. That's the difference between a sniper and a killer." He leaned forward. "Whitmore saw something in you. Something beyond technical skill. And I see it too. Don't let people's small minds make you small. You hearing me?" I nodded. I'd heard it before. I'd keep hearing it. That was the price of being excellent while black in America. But I'd keep paying it, because the alternative was giving up, and that wasn't in my DNA. Now I'm back in my workshop, and the afternoon light is slanting through the windows, casting long shadows across the workbench. I've got a piece of oak in front of me, half carved into something that might be a duck or might be kindling, depending on how steady my hands are today. The radio is playing soft jazz, and I can hear my wife in the kitchen, making dinner, humming along to the music. 53 confirmed kills. 3 tours. Purple Heart when an IED flipped our vehicle outside Kandahar. Bronze Star for that day in the valley when everything went wrong and somehow went right. And a personal letter from Admiral Whitmore, stored in a safe deposit box at the bank, because my wife says it's too valuable to keep at home. I haven't seen Whitmore in years. He's retired now, lives somewhere in Virginia, writes books about military strategy and leadership. Sometimes I think about reaching out, thanking him for seeing something in me that others couldn't see, for giving me a chance when chances were hard to come by. But I never do. Some debts are too big to repay, and sometimes the best thank you is just to live the lessons, to be the man he believed you could be. My grandson comes running into the workshop, 6 years old and full of energy, holding a toy helicopter. "Grandpa, make it fly." I pick him up, make helicopter sounds, spin him around until he's dizzy with laughter. He doesn't know about Helmand Province or Scout Sniper School or Admiral Whitmore. He just knows I'm Grandpa, the guy who makes wooden ducks and tells silly jokes, and always has butterscotch candies in his pocket. Maybe someday I'll tell him the other stories. Maybe someday he'll need to hear them. But not today. Today, he's just a kid, and I'm just a grandpa, and the world is simple and good. That's worth more than any medal. I found out what happened to Kowalski through the usual military channels. The informal network of guys who keep in touch, who send Christmas cards and occasional emails, who show up at reunions and tell the same stories over and over. He made sergeant, did another tour in Afghanistan, got out in 2015. Works as a police officer somewhere in Ohio now. He sent me a message a few years back through Facebook of all things. It was short. I'm sorry. I was wrong. You were the best Marine I ever served with. Thank you for not letting me die for my stupidity. I never responded. Not because I was holding a grudge, but because some apologies are complete as they are. Adding, I forgive you, would have required me to acknowledge there was something to forgive, and I didn't want to live in that space. He'd learned. He'd grown. That was enough. Captain Henderson retired as a major, teaches ROTC at a university in North Carolina. We exchange Christmas cards. His son is a Marine now, did a tour in Syria. The cycle continues. Chen and Williams both got out, started a security company together. They do private contracting, mostly boring stuff, corporate security, event protection. Burke stayed in, made sergeant major, runs a training program at Camp Pendleton. Good men, all of them. Flawed, like we all are, but good at their core. And Admiral Whitmore? He died 3 years ago. Heart attack in his study, surrounded by books and maps and memories. I got the call on a Tuesday morning, my wife handing me the phone with a look that said she knew this would hurt. The voice on the other end was official, clipped, military. Someone from the Admiral's staff letting me know about the funeral arrangements, asking if I planned to attend. Of course I planned to attend. The man had changed my life. The man had seen something in me when the world was determined to see nothing. The funeral was at Arlington, and I drove up alone, 5 hours from Virginia, listening to old jazz stations and trying not to think too hard about what I'd lost. The cemetery was exactly what you'd expect. Rows of white headstones stretching toward the horizon like soldiers in formation, oak trees providing shade, tourists with cameras trying to be respectful while still getting their photos. The service was held in the chapel, and I'd never seen so much brass in one place. Generals, admirals, colonels, wearing their dress uniforms with ribbons that told stories of decades in service. Politicians who'd known Whitmore through his advisory work. Former students, fellow snipers, Marines who'd served under his command in places whose names most Americans couldn't pronounce. I sat in the back, didn't speak to anyone, just listened to the eulogies, and tried to reconcile the legend being described with the man I'd known. They talked about his 400 confirmed kills, his tactical brilliance, his strategic mind. They talked about how he'd advised 3 presidents, how his doctrine on asymmetric warfare had changed modern military thinking, how he'd written the book, literally written the textbook, on long-range precision shooting. But nobody talked about what he was like as a teacher. Nobody mentioned the patience he showed when a young Marine from Detroit couldn't get the breathing technique right, how he'd stay after class, demonstrating the rhythm over and over until it clicked. Nobody talked about the way he'd pull you aside and tell you that doubt was just fear wearing a disguise, that the only way past it was through it. Nobody mentioned that he'd fought his own battles with the brass, that being a working-class kid from Montana in an officer corps full of Ivy League graduates had taught him something about being underestimated. He'd never said it explicitly, but I think that's why he saw me. Because he'd been there too, just with a different kind of prejudice, a different set of assumptions to overcome. The rifle volleys cracked through the air, 7 Marines firing 3 rounds each, and the sound brought me back to 100 different moments. Training ranges, live fire exercises, actual combat, 21 shots that echoed off the hills and faded into silence. Then taps, played by a young Marine whose lips barely moved as the mournful notes drifted across the cemetery. I watched the flag being folded, each crease precise and deliberate, watched it being presented to Mrs. Whitmore, watched her clutch it to her chest with the kind of grief that comes from 50 years of marriage ending in a moment. She held herself with such dignity, such strength, that I understood where the Admiral had learned his own stoicism. They'd been a team, partners in every sense, and now she was alone with memories and medals, and a flag that represented a nation her husband had served with everything he had. The reception was at the officers' club, all polished wood and formal portraits, and I stood by the window with a glass of water, watching Marines and officers network and share stories. I felt out of place, like I always did in these settings, but I'd come to pay my respects and I wasn't leaving until I'd done that. That's when she found me. Mrs. Whitmore, navigating through the crowd with the kind of grace that comes from a lifetime of military receptions and official dinners. She was smaller than she'd seemed at the funeral, more fragile, but her eyes were sharp and clear. "You're Bishop," she said. Not a question. A statement of fact. I nodded, unsure what to say, but she saved me the trouble. "Charles talked about you. Right up to the end. Even when the medication made him fuzzy, when he couldn't remember what year it was or who'd just visited, he remembered his students, especially you." She reached into her purse and pulled out a photograph, yellowed with age, edges worn from handling. It showed a younger Whitmore, maybe 50, standing with 24 Marines in training gear. I was there, front row, looking impossibly young, my face serious and focused. "He kept this on his desk," she said, "for 20 years, through 3 different offices, through retirement, through everything. This photograph stayed on his desk." I couldn't speak. My throat had closed up, and I was afraid if I tried to say anything, I'd embarrass myself in front of all these officers and dignitaries. She continued, her voice soft but steady. "He said you were proof that excellence transcends prejudice, that character outlasts discrimination. He was proud of you. So proud, he followed your career, you know. Every promotion, every deployment, every commendation. He had a file in his study, newspaper clippings and copies of reports like you were his son or something." She smiled, a sad smile that carried decades of love and loss. "I think in a way, all of you were his sons. He never had children of his own, so he poured everything into his students. But you were special. You were the one who proved he was right. Right about his teaching methods, right about his belief that talent transcends background, right about his conviction that the Corps needed to look beyond the surface to find its best warriors." She pressed the photograph into my hand. "I want you to have this. Charles would want you to have it. He'd want you to remember that someone believed in you, even when others didn't, especially when others didn't." I left the reception early, couldn't handle any more conversation, any more handshakes from people who didn't know me and didn't understand what Whitmore had meant to me. I sat in my truck in the parking lot, holding that photograph, staring at my younger self and trying to remember what it felt like to be that Marine. Full of potential but uncertain, talented but doubting, capable but constantly questioned. Whitmore had seen past all of that. He'd seen the shooter I could become, the Marine I would be, the man I was underneath the assumptions and prejudices and low expectations. And he'd bet on me, not with words or promises, but with time and attention, and a recommendation letter that opened doors I didn't even know existed. I didn't cry at the funeral, didn't cry at the reception, didn't cry during the drive home, even though the photograph sat on the passenger seat like a passenger itself, a ghost of who I used to be. But that night in my workshop, surrounded by half-finished projects and the smell of sawdust, I cried for the man who'd seen me when others looked away, for the mentor who'd given me more than shooting skills. He'd given me permission to be excellent without apology. I cried for the father figure I'd found in an unexpected place, for the belief he'd shown when belief was rare, for the dignity he'd afforded me when dignity was often denied. I cried because the world had lost someone who made it better. And I'd lost someone who made me better. And that kind of loss doesn't get easier with time. It just gets more familiar. The price of war isn't measured in bullets or scars or purple hearts. It's measured in the dreams you don't have anymore, the moments you can't get back, the version of yourself that died somewhere in the desert and never came home. I sleep 4 hours a night on a good night. On bad nights, I don't sleep at all. I sit in this workshop and pretend to work on projects until the sun comes up, and it's safe to go back inside, safe to pretend I'm normal. My wife knows. She's known from the beginning. She wakes up when I leave the bed, and sometimes she comes out here, brings me tea, doesn't say anything, just sits with me in the darkness. That's love. Not the romance novel kind, not the movie kind, but the real kind. The kind that sits with you in your hell and doesn't try to fix it, just keeps you company until the dawn. My hands shake sometimes. The VA says it's neurological. Side effects from God knows what. Burn pits, chemical exposure, the constant stress of deployment. They give me pills that don't really work, and appointments with counselors who mean well but can't possibly understand. How do you explain to someone who's never been in combat what it's like to kill another human being? How do you explain that it's not the killing that haunts you? It's the ease of it, the mechanical simplicity, the way your brain can reduce a person to a target and a calculation and a trigger pull? How do you explain that you're good at it, that you're better at it than most people are at anything, and that expertise comes with a weight you'll carry until you die? I don't talk about it much. The guys at the VFW understand without talking. We sit, we drink coffee, we watch football, and we don't mention the things we've seen. We just exist in that shared space of knowing, of having been there, of carrying the same invisible burden. That's enough. Sometimes that's all you need, just knowing you're not alone. Here's what I learned in 62 years, 20 of them in uniform, 35 of them carrying the weight of what I did in uniform. Character is what you do when nobody's watching, but character is also what you do when everybody's watching, and they expect you to fail. Dignity isn't given. It's claimed. It's chosen. It's maintained through every insult, every low expectation, every moment someone treats you as less than what you are. My great-uncle Samuel held a hill in Korea. My father showed up to the Ford plant every day for 30 years. My mother worked double shifts so I could have school supplies. They didn't do those things because they were extraordinary people. They did them because they were ordinary people facing extraordinary prejudice, and they refused to be broken by it. I carried a rifle in Afghanistan. I made impossible shots. I saved lives. I earned a call sign from a legend. But none of that makes me special. It just makes me part of a long line of Black Americans who had to be twice as good to get half the recognition, who had to exceed expectations just to be seen as equal, who had to maintain dignity in the face of constant doubt. That's not noble. That's not heroic. That's just reality. And the lesson isn't that you should have to work twice as hard. The lesson is that the system that requires it is broken. But until the system changes, you still have to live in it. So you do the work. You maintain the standard. You exceed the expectations. Not because you should have to, but because your ancestors did, and their strength lives in you. Because somewhere, a young Black kid is watching, wondering if they can make it, if they're good enough, if they belong. And you have to show them that yes, they can. Yes, they are. Yes, they do. That's the real mission. That's the shot that matters most. The sun is setting now, painting my workshop in shades of amber and gold. My wife calls from the house that dinner's ready, and I can smell pot roast, which means she's making an effort, trying to ground me in the present with the comfort of a good meal. I stand up, my knees protesting after sitting too long, and I look around this space I've built. Tools organized on the wall, each in its place. Projects in various states of completion. A photo of my platoon, all of us young and hard and ready, before we knew what we were ready for. A shadow box with medals I don't look at often. A wooden duck that's starting to actually look like a duck. This is my life now. Quiet, ordinary, broken in places, healed in others, scarred everywhere. I'm not in the desert anymore. I'm not looking through a scope, calculating wind and distance and the weight of a life in my crosshairs. I'm just an old Marine, trying to build something instead of destroy, trying to create beauty instead of death, trying to be someone his grandson can be proud of, without knowing all the dark things Grandpa had to do. The radio is playing Coltrane, A Love Supreme, and the notes fill the workshop like water filling a glass, and for just a moment, everything is exactly as it should be. No war, no prejudice, no calculations, just music and light and the smell of pot roast from the kitchen. Just a man, standing in his workshop, grateful to be alive, grateful to have survived, grateful that someone once saw his potential when others saw only his skin, grateful for every day he gets to be ordinary, because he's earned the right to be ordinary after years of having to be exceptional. The shadows lengthen. The day ends. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges, its own memories, its own moments of having to prove what should never require proof. But that's tomorrow. Tonight there's pot roast and jazz, and a grandson who wants to hear a story before bed. Tonight, I'm just a man going home to his family. That's victory enough. If this story found you at the right moment, tell me where you're listening from. Sometimes sharing these difficult memories makes them easier to carry. We all carry something. Maybe yours is different than mine, but the weight is familiar. Drop a comment. Let me know I'm not the only one still fighting these fights, still proving what should never need proving. And if you know a young person, black, brown, white, doesn't matter, who doubts whether they belong, whether they're good enough, whether they can make it, share this with them. Not because my story is special, but because everyone needs to hear that excellence is possible, that dignity is worth fighting for, that you can carry the weight and still stand tall. Subscribe if you want more stories from the other side of silence. We've got a lot to say. We've been quiet for too long.